Welcome, everybody, to the February 19th, 2022 meeting of the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara. I want to welcome everyone who's here from the Humanist Society, along with the Atheist Republic supporters and others. So how did we come to have Susanna McIntyre as a speaker? Well, it starts back in 2017 when Dr. Ali Rizvi was a speaker. He actually came here to Santa Barbara, and we got a big room, and we filled the room at the Faulkner Gallery at the Santa Barbara Public Library. At that time, he had recently published his book, The Atheist Muslim. It was a phenomenal talk. And during that talk, he told us that he had recently, with a couple of his colleagues, started a podcast, which is now called Secular Jihadists for Muslim Enlightenment. And I was so impressed with Ali and with his book that I started listening to the podcast. I went back to episode number 1, listened to them all the way through, and that's how I found out about Armin. So then, fast forward a couple years, and we invited Armin to be our speaker. This was just at the beginning of the pandemic. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to be here in person. One of our very first Zoom meetings, fabulous, talking about enlightenment values. And Armin also has a book, Why There Is No God, which is a very good book if you're looking for simple responses to common questions about the existence of God. Then I'm listening to these podcasts. Behold, they had this guest on March 25th, 2020. It was Susanna McIntyre, and I'm sitting here listening to it. And I was really impressed with Susanna's preparation, with her knowledge, and with her ability to express complex thoughts with a lot of nuance. And I think at the beginning, it's like, oh, wow, it's Armin and Ali. By the end, it's like she was a peer. And my thought was, whoa, here's the next generation of secular activist leader. She's authentic, compelling, and compassionate. That's how she occurred for me. And then it was just a month or two later, I don't know, where all of a sudden I find out that Susanna is now president and CEO of Atheist Republic. And I was cheering. I thought, this is really great. So now we have Susanna. With that, Susanna, I will turn it over to you. And thank you so much for being willing to speak to our group.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you, Judy. That was one of the sweetest things I've heard in a long time. So, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me. It's super exciting to see so many familiar faces and a lot of new faces from the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara. Wonderful to be here. I think you guys have an awesome organization. And of course, thank you to Judy. So I'm going to be giving a talk called Building Godless Community and International Engagement. So before we dive into it, I just want to give us a little outline so we know what we're getting into. I'm going to start with a little bit of my background, my journey away from religion. And then I'm going to talk about my organization, Atheist Republic, what we do, a little bit of our history, and I think some of the strengths and accomplishments of our organization. And then I'm going to get into the real meat of what we're here to talk about, which is international engagement. How can we harness the power of global atheism? And then we'll have a Q&A. So who am I? Where did I come from? How did I grow up? Why am I an atheist? So my name is Susanna McIntyre. I'm currently the president and CEO of Atheist Republic. I was elected to the board in May of 2020. I was raised as a Catholic. So I was baptized when I was a baby. Here's a picture of me shortly after my baptism. Fun fact, I actually, maybe a little bit of a foreshadowing, I actually peed on my dad immediately after being baptized and handed it back to him from the priest. So maybe I wasn't, so sure about this whole process from the very beginning. I grew up in a very Catholic community. I kind of joke and say that I was so Catholic, I didn't know that I was Catholic. I didn't actually really understand that we were Catholics until the age of 14. I knew that there were other religions. I knew that there were other Christians, but it was kind of like, oh, well, like everyone's Catholics, right? So here's a picture of me on the left of my first day of kindergarten, my first day of Catholic school, was a little uncertain about this whole process. And then on the right, we see a picture of me in my little Catholic schoolgirl uniform. I'm probably in first or third grade around here. So I grew up, in kind of a strict environment. There are very clear rules and expectations when you go to these kinds of institutions, very clear teachings about what is appropriate and what is not okay. I didn't grow up with nuns slapping my wrists with rulers and stuff like that, but there is still, a lot of strict expectations about how you conduct yourself and a lot of messaging surrounding that and what makes you good or bad, right? So growing up Catholic, I did fulfill a number of sacraments. I was baptized, I did my reconciliation, I did my first communion. By the time I started to get older, it was time for confirmation. It was pretty clear at that point that I was not with the program. And so my parents kind of made the decision. They had picked up the sense at that time that trying to get me to go through that process would probably be more pain than it was worth, because my reaction to a lot of the dictates and rules surrounding religion was a lot of rebellion. My therapist describes it as, quote unquote, burning down the church. My reaction to a lot of these dictates was to just really fight back hard. And so I didn't go the step of confirmation. I kind of just left it off at my communion. So how did I begin to leave religion? Well, it started in kind of an unexpected way, or what might be kind of silly upon reflection, but this is just how it happened to me. So when I was 12 years old, I had been going to one Catholic school from kindergarten to fifth grade my entire life. And this was my whole community. This was everyone I had ever known. And my parents made the decision that they were going to take me out of that school, and then they were going to send me to a Catholic all-girls school, not even on the other side of town, but in a completely different city. And I really didn't like this. I felt like it felt very violating to me as a child because I had no say in the matter. And it was hurtful to feel like my own desires for myself were not considered or valid at all. Actually, now that I've grown up, I think that going to this all-girls school was actually a really positive experience, and I appreciate a lot of the benefits that I got from an all-girls education. There's a lot of studies about various benefits to this, but at the time, this was really difficult for me. And this process of having my own desires not listened to or considered or validated made me kind of question my parents, because it was hurtful to me, as a little kid. Like, why aren't you listening to something that really makes me scared about, losing all my friends and stuff like that? And so I questioned them on this decision. And then it kind of made me question other things about what I had been taught. And this kind of extended into questioning God. And then when I was at the age of 14, I realized that I was bisexual. And then when I was the age of 16, I attempted suicide for a variety of reasons, not exactly religiously influenced, in my opinion. But if anyone knows anything about Catholicism, you know that these are two very big no-nos, or as I like to call them, they are two fast passes to hell. So I would kind of think of it as a crossroads. To be able to kind of cognitively survive or thrive amidst all these different messaging and knowing that I had done these things that were considered abominations, I had a decision where I kind of felt like I had to, leave God behind to be able to feel some appreciation or love for myself. Now, what's interesting is at the time, I thought that I had left God and I didn't believe in God. But now when I think about it and reflect, I think that I made the decision to not follow God. And it was emotionally motivated instead of actually going through the steps of thinking about evidences for or against the existence of God. So because I kind of made this decision to not follow God because I didn't think his rules were good, that doesn't actually mean that I didn't still kind of live this experience of feeling bad for not following God. I was very aware of how I wasn't doing things that I was raised to believe are good. I was very aware of how I was becoming more of a black sheep. And because I knew that I wasn't following God or these tenets about what is good, appropriate, or participating in things that are sinful, I kind of grew into believing that about myself. I treated myself like I was a bad person. I did feel like I was a bad girl for these things. So that was, a lot of my inner struggle. And this contributed to a lot of feelings of shame and guilt. A lot of, well, pretty much any ex-Catholic will tell you about their experiences of guilt and shame. It's pretty characteristic of what we go through. I remember one time a family member of mine was joking. It was like, if you have time to think, you have time to feel guilty. That's often how it feels sometimes. And this is something I still struggle with today, but luckily I have a lot more tools and I'm more equipped to deal with it. So how did this affect me into my young adulthood? Coming into my adulthood, or young adulthood, this left me really with a deep and urgent search for identity. Partially, this is just developmentally appropriate. If you look at cognitive psychology from the ages of your late adolescence to your early 20s, this is actually when we are supposed to be questioning ourselves, questioning our environment, reevaluating teachings, and searching for a new sense of identity formation. Amongst this identity formation, I really struggled because I come from a conservative background, and in that background, there isn't space for acceptance of these aspects of myself. And in contrast, who is supposed to lend me these things? It would be more politically left-oriented people. And also just politically over the past 50 years, who has achieved more gaining in rights for people like me? It would be the left. So that's just how I inherently oriented in more of a reactionary way, and less because of maybe thoroughly studying the reasons behind certain values or political orientations. Because of this, I got really into leftism. I went to college in the Bay Area. This is a picture of me in Golden Gate Park in college. I call this my quote unquote shitty kids phase, because I really did feel like I was a shitty kid. I did feel like I wasn't good. And so I treated myself like that. And I engaged in behavior that reflected that attitude towards myself. Partially because of, like I said, kind of this reactionary just orientation towards being on the left because of where I thought I could find some semblance of acceptance, and partially because of the environment of the Bay Area itself and a lot of online communities that I was engaged in. I got really into what most people nowadays would kind of call like a woke phase, a woke doctrine or dogma. This manifested in a lot of different ways, and this was partially imbued through my university education. Like, I received a minor in critical gender and sexuality studies. So, this whole panic that we see nationally now about critical race theory is very interesting to me, because this is something I actually did study, at the university level. And I, in fact, received honors for my writings on the topic. But I took it even further than that. Partially after Trump got elected, I got really politically radicalized by a lot of the things that I was seeing in our country. And I felt like what I was seeing was just intolerable. And I couldn't imagine that there were adults, older than me that I was surrounded by that weren't doing everything in their power to stop this from happening. It just seemed incomprehensible to me. And who did I see doing something seemingly in my environment, putting boots on the ground? Well, if you're familiar with the Bay Area for the past 5 to 10 years, that would be Antifa. So I started to kind of get into that scene. That was really interesting. Fast forward to 2019, I was going through a period of just severe mental unwellness, and I started to study critical thinking and cult psychology because I wanted to try to grapple with this severe self-loathing that was a hangover from these attitudes about my own sexuality. That was really becoming like a detriment to my well-being and just wellness in general. So through studying this cult psychology to try to kind of understand the ways that these attitudes that were imbued in me in childhood were affecting me nowadays, I actually started to learn critical thinking in a more structured format. And coincidentally, I discovered how much a lot of the more political ideologies that I had aligned with or engaged in had a lot of red flags or dangerous elements to them. Along this process, I discovered the atheist community online. And I really got into this because I thought it was a really good way to practice practicing my critical thinking, observing logical fallacies, being able to identify those more in my everyday life. And along the way, I discovered the ex-Muslim movement online. And this just completely blew my whole world wide open. I was just completely, it was just shocking. Because a lot of criticisms that come from the ex-Muslim movement really reflected back to me very deep flaws in the ways that I had previously been considering my leftism or my activism. And it really revealed a lot of inconsistencies and how a lot of attitudes or tactics are quite illiberal and actually maybe antithetical towards pro-social societal benefit. Particularly this criticism of multiculturalism and inclusivity kind of as a doctrine. Like I'm not trying to say that I don't like multiculturalism and inclusivity. I'm actually very passionate about it. But especially through a lot of things I see here in my particular area of the Bay Area, I see a lot of ways where it can become kind of a dogma. And I actually think that in practice, it can become antithetical towards bringing people together, building a superordinate identity that we can organize under, and instead emphasizes too much on viewing all of our identities through a matrices of oppression to a point where it actually splinters people more than it can bring them together. And so this kind of helped me leave the radical left. And I really enjoyed the community that I found through atheist communities online because I thought it was more okay to question. It felt like questions were more welcomed. Critical thinking and questioning was vocally appreciated and encouraged. And that was super refreshing to me. And then after some time, holy cow, I became the president and CEO of Atheist Republic. So that's what I've been doing since then. I'm going to leave my own personal journey there, but you're welcome to ask me questions about that during the Q&A because I wanted to get into more meat. So let's talk about Atheist Republic. What is this organization? What do we do? Where did we start? And what have we done? Atheist Republic is the largest community of atheists in the world. And we have local consulates, because as a republic, quote unquote, we need to have consulates to represent us. We have consulates in over 70 countries around the globe. Our mission is primarily at the foremost to provide a community for atheists to express their non-belief. And along those lines, we also fight for global secularism and in particular, the promotion of free expression, because I truly believe that this is a prerequisite to all the other aspects of our mission. Atheist Republic started as a Facebook page where we now have over 2 million people who follow us there. We also have the largest atheist-centered accounts on many other social media platforms like Twitter and Instagram. We have a growing audience on YouTube, Discord, pretty much every social platform. If you're looking for it, we're probably there. And having this large social media platform really allows us to have a variety of content that can help reach people and provide content that they can relate to, whether it's criticism of religion, or maybe it's just humor and jokes about religion or certain, puns about atheism that just helps people feel like they have a community and somewhere, people that understand them and they kind of have similar interests. That's really important. And because Atheist Republic started as a Facebook page to explicitly provide atheists a place to express their rejection of religion without judgment, this has evolved in a number of ways. So we started as this public Facebook page, but then there are a lot of people who want to engage with our content, but they can't do it publicly because they either want to preserve their privacy or it would actually be unsafe for them to do so in their country or environment. So because of that, we started a private group that people can join. This is also one of the largest private groups for atheists in general on Facebook. And then as we grew and grew, all of a sudden people want more groups to express their particular interests. So we have gaming groups, we have book clubs, we even have a dating community. If you guys are interested in any of these things, you can find it at atheistrepublic.com/consulates. And for a lot of people, online community is one thing, but what they really want is in-person community where they can find in their city, where they are, where they can really bond. And this is really important. This is really important because a sense of belonging is one of the most important psychological protectants against so many negative indicators. A sense of belonging is very important to protect against suicidality. And so we have our in-person groups. So these are our consulates that we are talking about. Here we have a picture of our consulates in the Philippines, Kuala Lumpur, and Mexico City. And we have them all over the place. If you're near a major city, we probably have a consulate for you. So again, you can check them out at atheistrepublic.com/consulates. And this is also important because there's been a lot of studies about how atheists have worse mental health outcomes than believers. But what's interesting is if you look at a lot of these studies, they didn't accurately control for church membership or religious community membership when comparing the non-believers to the believers, because having community can really help people cope with perhaps familial rejection that they've experienced because of their non-belief. Maybe it helps them find a sense of chosen community, because once again, familial rejection can be a very strong indicator of negative mental health outcomes. So providing a community and a sense of belonging for people is so important. We're social animals, so a sense of belonging isn't just a want. It actually is a need. And so for people who want their community to be centered around their lack of belief, we provide that for them. And this is what I love about, this is one of the things I love about Atheist Republic the most. For me, I love the fact that we are, by definition, because we're the largest, we're also the most diverse atheist community in the world. There's so many people who have such a plethora of experiences, so many different religious backgrounds, and it provides me so many opportunities to learn from people, to learn about what faith they came from, to learn about how that experience manifested itself in their country, to have friends all over the world. This global vision and this global network is something that's very important to me. And I think it is one of the things that makes our community so special. We've done a lot over the years. We've had different issues where different community members have been threatened. We've had a lot of different various projects that I could dive into. I won't get into it right now because let's get into why we're here. Let's talk about the international engagement. So like I said, we know that there are atheists all over the world, but how can we talk to each other? How can we take advantage of the fact that we are all over the world? So before we get into it, let's get the lay of the land. What are global atheism by the numbers? Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a updated, really pretty picture of populations across the world. So this image is from 2010, but we do have more up-to-date data. But when we look at atheists around the world, it is very difficult to study this. One, because definitions of atheism varies greatly in different cultural contexts. Two, because a lot of people might not exactly self-identify as atheists, but they might be non-believers. And if you ask them specific questions about their faith or lack thereof, you will find that they actually do technically align with an atheist. They just don't call themselves that. And then it's also difficult because oftentimes researchers aren't asking questions about us. So when they do religious population surveys, they'll say, oh, are you a Christian, a Muslim, a Buddhist, etc. And then there is, say, none or religiously unaffiliated. But just because someone will put none on a survey, that doesn't actually mean that they're atheists. There are a lot of religiously unaffiliated people who have kind of vague spiritual beliefs, maybe kind of a superstitious practice. So again, it makes it very difficult to really dial in and operationalize these research questions because of all the instances that I just explained. Let's look at some more recent data. So we do know that although we are a global minority and we are a local minority, in any given country, we are growing. So there was a recent survey put out by Pew Research Center that says 3 in 10 American adults are now religiously unaffiliated. And you can see this chart on the side that shows how from 2007 to 2021, our population nearly doubled. And what's so interesting about what we observe in the United States is that although Christianity is declining, the other religions aren't really growing to compensate for that. It's just people seem to be leaving religion entirely. Now, again, they might have other aspects of spiritual beliefs that just don't fit within, an organized religion. But in general, the pews are emptying, so to speak. And also, according to an article by the Oxford Handbook of Atheism, published in 2013, there are approximately 450 to 500 million non-believers worldwide, or roughly 7% of the global population. Once again, that was conducted almost 10 years ago, so we really do need updated information. But people tend to focus a lot more on, when asking these questions, on America or the quote-unquote free world. But this isn't observed just in these countries. We also see this in other areas of the world as well. So according to the Arab Barometer and a survey they put out in 2019, the share of Arabs describing themselves as quote unquote non-religious is up to 13%, up from 8% in 2013. That includes nearly half of young Tunisians, a third of young Libyans, and a quarter of young Algerians, and a fifth of young Egyptians. That shows that we are growing around the world. It's very difficult to get accurate information in some areas of the world because it is more dangerous to be non-believing in certain areas, or maybe you live in a country that is much more closed off from the world like Iran, where that inherently makes it more difficult to get accurate information and access to a population to ascertain their beliefs. But there is one survey that came out of Iran somewhat recently, within the past 2 years, and if true, it demonstrates that Muslims are now a minority in Iran, with only around, I think, 23% of the population actually believing in Shia Islam, which I thought was fascinating. But once again, we do need to get more information. We do need more research and more accurate and representative data. So I hope that more people are working on this, because a lot of the numbers I found were from almost 10 years ago. Now that we kind of understand, like where we are, what the numbers are, let's look at how we can talk to each other. I'm going to put forward maybe a little bit of a controversial idea. I think it could be said that theists, believers, are better at international organizing than atheists and non-believers. Let's dig into why. Do theists do it better? Well, first of all, let's just take like Muslims and Christians, for example. They have been organizing internationally for centuries. So here is a picture of I found when I was looking for a representation of this, I found something from an organization called Godless, which is a Catholic geographic database. And so imagine an extremely data-rich version of Google Maps that shows all the Catholic properties around the world. It shows what kind of property they are, what kind of missions they support, the ecological environment they're in, including different Catholic hierarchies. Unfortunately, there isn't a publicly available version of this at the moment, so these are the best pictures I could find. But I thought that this is kind of a tiny snapshot or a tiny glimpse into how vast their network is. And I would absolutely die to have something like this, an atheist or non-believer version of that visually represented our networks around the world, because this is super helpful and important information. It makes it easier for us to find each other, for example. Theists, they have a lot of advantages. First of all, like I said, they've been doing this for a long time, and I'm not trying to negate the fact that there have been people, free thinkers that were prominent and doing speaking tours for the past 2 centuries or whatever. But in the age of the internet, it's kind of brought on a whole different level and a new opportunity. And also we've seen the explosion of atheist community online, and that's a really important opportunity for us to talk to each other. Theists, they actually have a lot of benefits. And what I'm about to talk to is kind of generally more ideological benefits. Well, in a physical level, they have the benefit of more brick and mortar infrastructure, and they also have structured transnational institutions. And so an established network is just built in, and it's been established and been functioning for a long time. And as much as we are against their ideas, we are not theists, or we don't like the way that they evangelize, we have to, look at how they do succeed at networking. What are they doing right? So what are some benefits that they have that we don't have? Well, first of all, they have the benefit of dogma. For example, there's a lot of teachings about the inherent virtue of giving and participating in these institutions or networks. So first thing I thought of was this hadith or Islamic scripture that says, quote, "I have heard from the messenger of Allah," or the Prophet Muhammad, saying, "He who built a mosque for Allah, the exalted, Allah would build for him a house in paradise." So I know this because I get a lot of ads for Islamic charities, and they oftentimes bring forward this scripture to say, hey, if you're giving to us, you're actually giving to yourself in heaven. So they're really incentivizing giving, donating, and participation by saying, oh, if you're participating in us, you're actually investing in yourself, which I thought was quite funny. It's highly incentivized. So like I said, they have the benefit of dogma. They also have the benefit of authority. So, this is particularly something that was important to me as a Catholic. They are taught the reverence towards the inherent righteous authority of these institutions, including an example, obviously, there's the Catholic Church, or even the Watchtower organization or the Jehovah's Witnesses will be taught that this is actually God's one true perfect organization. I actually think that's a very dangerous and toxic thing to teach people, but it actually obviously does inspire a lot of participation and belief in it being worthwhile to participate and donate in these organizations and their networks. Like I said, there's a lot of incentivized virtues. So it might be more explicit self-enlightened interest, like the example I gave before, or there's very explicitly taught virtues of charity, which I think is kind of different than what I encounter with many non-believers. Many non-believers just report a negative atheism, where they're saying, okay, so you're presenting a claim about the nature of God. I don't really see evidence for the nature of God, so I'm just not going to, engage. That's a negative position, a lack of a position. And, they don't necessarily put forward their own very structured pro-social worldview. Now, I don't mean that to say that atheists don't believe in charity. Obviously, that's not the case. And of course, many do have an actually structured worldview or why they should go forward and be altruistic. But if you kind of talk to your average quote unquote nun, they'll most likely just kind of talk about a general desire to do good in the world, which I think is a bit different than what you kind of encounter with some religious people, where it's very clear they're doing this because it is their duty as a member of their faith to protect the Ummah, to protect fellow Muslims, or it's their duty to help spread God's message, or it's faiths without works is meaningless, which I think that kind of structure to it provides a very different flavor. And what I find very interesting to think about is religious people also, in terms of these networks, have the benefit of intergenerational familial culture of participation. So in a lot of religious families, it's in their culture to participate in these religious organizations. This could take the form of maybe missionary families, or maybe they, throughout generations, you support different missionary projects. Or maybe what was common in my area is we all go participate in a local religious food bank. So the idea of continuing to participate is really passed down through generations, and it's something that actually brings people together, or maybe it's even an expectation. And this is important because it helps make this work and these networks and this organizing sustainable over long periods of time. And finally, at the same time, we have to recognize that a lot of these religions have the benefit of imperialist expansion, and this aided their establishment in different countries and different communities around the world. And at the time, this also gave them state-sponsored legitimacy. So this isn't something that's available to us, and they do have kind of this socio-historical benefit. It's something that happened, and they can still continue to benefit from it to this day. Well, what can we do? I want to take a quick detour, and I want to think in terms of atheist or non-believer, secular, humanist organizing. Who's actually most likely to get involved with this kind of organizing to begin with? So I read this academic paper that came out last year by Will Gervais et al. It basically talks about how a lot of atheists or non-believers think that they are non-believers because they have really good critical thinking skills and they kind of rationalize their way out of religion. Well, this paper seems to suggest that actually what is the most potent and what is most predictive of if someone is going to be an atheist in their adulthood is not their own reflective abilities or their own intellect, but actually if you look at the environment that they were raised in. So basically the amount of public or private religiosity of their parents. So this goes against a lot of non-believer narratives about our own critical thinking skills or the superiority of our rationality. And it's actually perhaps more accurate to say, actually it was because my parents weren't that religious. Which just is incredibly interesting to me, because in my work, in terms of who I work with in my own organization and who I work with across other organizations, in my, albeit, this is important, anecdotal, observational experience. A lot of people who are really impassioned about this work are people who were raised religiously, but had an explicitly negative experience of religion and are really motivated to do this work because they experienced a harm and they would like to ensure that that harm doesn't happen to others. If the findings of this study is true, this leads me to believe that those who actually take the step of getting involved with atheist activism are actually a minority of non-believers themselves. You know, we do have a growing non-believing population at all that we can observe in many countries, but in terms of who is actually going to take the step to get involved with secular activism, it might be a very specific type of non-believer, which makes our population perhaps even smaller, kind of a minority within a minority. So with all that in mind, you know, what can we learn from non-believers? What can we propose instead? So one thing that I think is very important and that I was chewing over as I was preparing for this talk and thinking about is the importance of network inheritance. I kind of observe, again, this is an observation, you know, different atheist, humanist communities popping up all over the place. And we kind of maybe are kind of very atomized, kind of do our own thing by ourselves, but we don't have to reinvent. Oh wait, no, sorry, that point was for the next, that was for the next point. When I'm talking about network inheritance, what I mean to say is that we need to teach the importance of this participation to young activists. We don't want the work that the people who came before us to do to kind of fizzle out because it wasn't passed down. By bringing in younger activists, we can really help build a legacy and continue the legacy of those who came before us and who put, you know, their life's work into this. So we do need a lot of intergenerational communication in that way. And frankly, I think it would be to our benefit to get our children involved. And a lot of people might say, oh, Susanna, that's becoming too much like a religion. Now, I'm not saying that you have to involve your children. I would encourage voluntary participation. But in general, I think emphasizing to children the importance of global participation is something that is valuable. I would hope that this is something that they would want to engage in voluntarily. And I think this is really important because you can really build legacy organizations like Amnesty International, you know, an organization that has really sustained itself and built its global credibility over time. It continues to bring in young people, new talent, and to help really build that talent. To their credit, one organization who I think is doing a really good job of this is Humanist International, because they have programs like Young Humanists, where they are explicitly trying to recruit young people into humanist work. So another thing that we can propose instead is intra-organizational coordination. I think this would be a good remedy because, like I said, teased before, is we don't have to be reinventing the wheel every time we want to build an atheist organization. We can talk to each other and learn lessons from each other, what did and did not work, so that we can also become more efficient in our work. The only thing that's difficult about this is that atheists are not, well, people who take the step of getting involved in atheist and skeptic kind of communities tend to be people who are very wary of authority to begin with. And this can kind of make working together somewhat difficult sometimes and also prone to splintering. And working amongst each other can be prone to a lot of internal politics. Now, of course, this is not exclusive to atheists at all, but I saw an interesting study from 2011 that profiled different personality traits of people who actually are involved in not just non-believers, but actively involved in some sort of non-believing community. And they found, amongst other things, that people who take the step to get involved with non-believing communities are, quote unquote, less agreeable. Now, this doesn't mean that they aren't nice or that they are, you know, ornery people. By less agreeable, it means that they are more likely to be willing to take unpopular opinions, kind of speaking to the fact that a lot of us in some ways are black sheep. And so it can sometimes be difficult to organize a lot of black sheep together because this kind of these outsider perspectives or the willingness to take outsider perspectives can lead to the butting of heads. But I still think it is very worthwhile to work together and something that we should focus on and work on. And finally, I think if we want to build and sustain an international network, we need to go beyond just a lack of a position, meaning that we have to go beyond a negative atheism. And I think we should actually go forward and assert values. And this is where humanism comes in. So I would be remiss if I was at the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara and didn't talk about humanism. So here on the left, we see a little chart that I got from thehumanist.com. And this kind of talks about 10 humanist values or 10 commitments. And I really like this framing instead of 10 commandments, because it's not just commandments that come down from a higher authority. These are commitments that we make to each other. And I think that stresses the role of personal responsibility and also accountability to a certain extent. And you can see that a lot of these values are very pro-socially focused, like humility, altruism, service, and participation. So these are really important humanist values that we should explicitly promote. And then at Atheist Republic, we really like to promote enlightenment values. So here I have a little etching that kind of reminded me of the Enlightenment, because he has this like little flame of knowledge. And so these are things like free expression, pluralism, protection of minorities, rationalism, due process, equality under the law, etc. And when we go forward and participate in society as non-believers, I think we should explicitly promote our labels as we do this participation. This includes political participation. A lot of people might find this kind of controversial. They might try to talk us out of this, because they think, oh, well, that's what religious people do. Well, I think, why should we let them, meaning the religious, have a monopoly on this kind of engagement, especially considering the fact that our populations are growing so rapidly in places like North America in particular. I believe that we must go forward and demand representation and power within the body politic. And this, again, might be kind of controversial. I actually think that we should promote the adoption of an in-group identity of being an atheist or humanist. Now, a lot of people might perceive this as me being tribal. And I don't mean an in-group identity in terms of we dislike people from the out-group, because I actually really despise tribalism and I try to oppose it when I can. But what I mean by this is, one, we should promote the adoption of these identity labels for the purposes of destigmatization, because different surveys show that people who are non-religious are viewed by societies as the least trustworthy by others. So we help destigmatize it, show that we can engage in very pro-social ways. And two, I think we should promote identifying ourselves with these labels, because it can help us find a tent that we can all organize under. Now, people are going to say, Susanna, that sounds like identity politics. And I would say, yes, you are right. Now, I have a lot of criticisms of identity politics in America, but I will never negate the fact that identity politics are important and a necessary tool in certain circumstances, particularly considering the fact that when you have a group that has a common set of issues, you need to unify together to help present those issues to those who have the power to change them in a more cohesive way. And so while I have a lot of criticisms of the excesses of identity politics, I think that there are instances where it is to our benefit to use them. And this is one of those instances. I think in terms of building a network that we participate in globally, we should, among these humanist values of really pro-social, altruistic values, charity should be considered one of them. Now, a lot of people don't like this concept of charity. And a lot of my experience with this comes from my far lefty days, where charity is really criticized or completely dismissed because they view it as a vertical relationship instead of a horizontal relationship. I think that there's a lot of charity that is still very worthwhile, but we don't have to engage that way. We can also move from a charitable lens towards a lens of solidarity. And this is particularly important in international atheist organizing, and I will talk about why. So let's look at some big issues at hand. We have a lot of apostasy laws around the world. There are a number of countries around the world where apostasy is criminalized, and at least 10 countries where apostasy can be punishable by death by the state. Also, we have a plethora of blasphemy laws around the world. So there are blasphemy laws on the books in 84 countries around the world. That's 1/3 of the world's countries. But it's not just the fact that there are so many blasphemy laws around the world, it's particularly the severity of them that is particularly concerning. So, for example, blasphemy is punishable by death in at least 8 countries. And the United States Committee of International Religious Freedom 2020 Blasphemy Report found that nearly half, 49% of the states that have blasphemy laws on the books actually enforce their blasphemy laws. Why is this important? This is important because as we have a global community of atheists, particularly in my work, I talk to and work with a lot of people who are in countries like this, and they are not able to have the freedom to go forward and assert their values and their beliefs or express their beliefs freely without fear of reprisal or actual harm. And so this is where this idea of solidarity comes in. I personally feel like it is a moral imperative that I have, because I live in the United States and my civil liberties are so protected within our Constitution. I really feel like I have a moral imperative to go forward and talk about these issues that other people can't talk about in their country because it's so dangerous to them. I think this is also important because again, this is a feeling that sometimes the North American or atheist communities in these quote unquote free countries or free societies have failed to do so. I talk to a lot of people who are in countries with a lot of these very severe restrictions, and they feel like they've been left behind. The people who can talk about these problems don't care because maybe it's taboo, maybe it'd be seen as politically incorrect to criticize these other cultures that you don't come from, that kind of thing. But those politically correct attitudes are leaving behind and doing a disservice to the millions of people within our global atheist community who can't really go forward and fight for these values in the same way in their own civil societies. So one way that we can help is by talking to our local governments, our local representatives, to emphasize the importance of promoting free expression in our international bilateral relations. So an amazing example of this is we had some resolutions passed through the House and the Senate of the United States that is actually going to prioritize the repeal of blasphemy and apostasy laws when engaging within countries around the world, because especially with a country where free expression is as important as the United States, I think we do have a responsibility to try to promote that where we can. So a special shout out to Senator Lincoln and Representative Jamie Laskin for really pushing forward those resolutions. Many American secular organizations like the Secular Coalition for America and Ex-Muslims in North America who went and talked to a lot of these representatives to get this push forward. But it doesn't always have to be engaging with our own government to raise the issues of the lack of civil liberties in these other countries. We can also go fight for specific people. So one example of this is the case of SOHEIL ARABI. So for those who don't know, SOHEIL ARABI is an Iranian atheist who was sentenced to death in 2013 for insulting the Prophet Muhammad in a Facebook post. And later, due to pressure that was put on the government and a lot of people raising this issue, his death sentence was commuted. So in 2019, Atheist Republic organized alongside many other organizations like the International Coalition of Ex-Muslims or the Council of Ex-Muslims in Britain, an international protest to free SOHEIL. So here on the left, we see someone with their free SOHEIL sign in Nigeria. And then on the bottom, we see a lot of people at a protest in Stockholm. And in fact, I have to give a special shout out to Dean Kruger, who is in the audience, because Dean was such an important part of organizing this international audience. So special shout out to Dean. And so talking about these issues, one, when we take up the case of really standing in solidarity with individually persecuted atheists, it helps raise the profile of the issue of blasphemy and apostasy laws at large, because more people, when they put a face to it, it's just how our brains work. We start to care about it more. And this is oftentimes how a lot of people learn about the issues of these restrictions on free expression for the first time. Another example would be in October 2021, Atheist Republic and the Ex-Muslims Council across Britain and Stockholm organized the International SOHEIL Day. And this was in reaction to SOHEIL's lawyer announcing that he was going to be sentenced to another 2 years in prison for spreading propaganda due to his promotion of atheism and prisoner rights. So we organized this SOHEIL Day, and then the amazing news came out the next month in November 2021 that SOHEIL had been released from prison. He still has to serve 2 years of internal exile, but this is an instance where continuing to raise our voices and put pressure on these governments can have some effect. A lot of people dismiss online activism or, Twitter campaigns as like, oh, no one cares. People actually are watching in these governments. Even, as restrictive of regimes as Iran, how they're viewed internationally does impact them. It does matter. I particularly like to bring up this case because I think it is an amazing example of solidarity with other Farsi-speaking atheist activists. I really believe that all of this wouldn't have been possible without working closely with other Iranian atheists. It is very important when you take up the cause to stand in solidarity with specific cases that you understand the reality on the ground. There are a lot of instances where an atheist may be persecuted for some aspect of their free expression or their identity, where it actually would be more dangerous if we all come out and start blasting their government on Twitter, right? So speaking to people who, one, speak the language, two, are from that background, they understand what the lay of the land can be. And three, they have the ability to organize within the larger community in general. For example, not just Persian atheists, but just Persians in general, and raise that question of building that larger base of people paying attention to this. It's also extremely important and just a source of invaluable information. So with all that in mind, and kind of this as an example, I would like to get into the Q&A, and then we can stop the recording because I know some people probably don't want to engage with this while it's being recorded because this is going to be published later. So I want to, really respect people's privacy. I would like to say thank you. Thank you to the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara for having me. You guys are an awesome little organization. Thank you for Judy for inviting me, one of the sweetest ladies ever. And I would also like to say thank you to my Atheist Republic board of directors because they are fantastic at supporting me. And I have to give a special shout out for Armin for giving me some very good little seeds of inspiration for the international engagement portion of this talk, which I think I want to expand into a whole presentation of its own. Thank you so much.
Susanna, thank you. And with that, we can stop recording, and I'll turn it back over to you, Susanna, for Q&A.